It's kind of weird. You look back at your life and you're like, oh, I guess I was on a path. I had no idea.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 105 of the Strokecast. Jane Connely is best known to the stroke community as Heal the Brain with Jane. She's an occupational therapist, and well, she really just has this unstoppable and exciting energy. It's amazing because she brings joy and passion to her patients, social media posts, and no-brainer podcast content, just all the time. She's also just fun to chat with, which is why we get to, well, almost nothing that was on my outline for this interview. So, let's go ahead and meet Jane. So, Jane, thanks so much for joining us on Strokecast for this episode.
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here. I've been following you for a long time, Bill, and I've just been waiting and waiting. This is like my Oscar moment.
Yeah, except it's the Oscar the Grouch moment.
Yeah. Whatever, I'll take it. I'm like super honored. I'm like, wow, I must be a real thing.
Absolutely. And I've certainly enjoyed the content you've been producing and the attitude you've brought to it, which is just awesome.
Oh.
And what I think is really cool too is that flexibility, that willingness to accept things and to just get those results. That sort of gets to the heart of what occupational therapy is about getting stuff done.
Yeah. And not going at it at such a linear, measured pace, at a more like, okay, what can we do today? Where can we push today? It feels much more like coaching, I think, than coming in and being pretty prescriptive, because you never know what somebody's going to bring in, and you bring in so much through your body, and your brain is a function of what your senses are doing. So yeah, it's been so much fun working in this population with brain injury, because I always thought I was a flexible person, but it has tested me, and I've gotten more so.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's one of the things we don't talk about a whole lot is just how much we talk about recovery often as sort of this straight path to getting back to doing, dressing, bathing, moving, cooking, doing things with your arm or your leg or whatever it is. But it's really a lot more flexible than that about getting to the results.
Yeah. Even with I think when I was in school, I was really taught more of a top-down model, even in the idea that like work on the shoulder first and then the hand will come last. And research recently, very recently in the last 2 years, I was actually talking on my podcast to, do you know Stronger After Stroke by Peter Levine?
I just started reading that.
Okay.
I'm just in the first chapter now.
Yeah, it's a little intense, but he's a big deal. And especially with, when in school, I remember reading a lot of his articles, because he's been published over 100 times in science articles. And so I was like really pumped that he wanted to talk to me, because I was, and basically it was because it was the beginning of Corona, and he was like, well, all my speaking engagements have been canceled. So yeah, I'll talk to you. It was very by chance. I think he would have had to say no. But anyway, he was talking too about how, for some people, the hand comes first and then the arm, and it's like everything changes, at least for me, and how we understand the brain every year. So you really have to stay up to snuff, and you also have to be really flexible. Like if you want to come in and have the same treatment plan for every right-sided CVA on the parietal lobe, it's just not going to work.
One of the things I really like about it when I've read his blog and read other content he's done is that he is so focused on the science, not on a brings a skepticism to other articles and content and other things, but it's not a hostile skepticism. It's, okay, what does the actual numbers say? Let's look at the numbers, let's look at the data, and let's draw our results from there. And I think that is something that is just so important with so much snake oil out there being peddled to brain injury survivors.
You said it. Snake oil, that makes me laugh too, because I'm a big fan of Dr. Sullivan, who was on your show. And we've become friends via the internet, like pretty good friends. It's so interesting. We're just like little soul sisters. And it's so funny though, because we could go for hours talking about how annoying the snake oil is, because it's so enticing. I mean, everybody just wants to have this change, and brain injury is not fun. It is a long, very winding road, and it just makes me angry because that snake oil can take you back, and then you have to restart over again, and it's just painful. And there's a lot of it.
If it's going to interrupt traditional therapy, think long and hard. If it's going to take money or time that is better spent other places, think long and hard before you go down those paths.
Oh, I love that. And that was, you had a whole episode on that. Yes, I loved that episode. I was like, can we broadcast this for everyone? Is everybody hearing this? Because you really have to bite your tongue too, because as a provider, they're like, oh, you're just in the medical model. You don't care. And I'm like, no, I do care. If there was a snake oil, then I would want to give it to my dad, who's a stroke survivor, right? Like, it's not, we're all affected by this. Like, it's not that we're not in isolation. We're all humans. So it can be really challenging, but they're like, oh, I got this. Even some of the devices, the medical devices, and then you try to call them. Like, I've tried to reach out to several medical devices that are for stroke, and they're making so much money because they're like, you don't need therapy anymore. Just come and do this. Put your hand in this. And it's like, our brain doesn't work that way.
Right.
Anyway.
Right. How did you get into this field to begin with then? How did you go through college and then think, you know what, I want to spend a couple more years and become an occupational therapist?
Oh, well, it's so funny. I mean, there was probably I come from kind of a medical family. My grandfather's was a doctor, and 4 of my uncles were, one was a surgeon, and then 2 were surgeons, and then 2 were doctors. And then my brother ended up becoming a doctor too. And so that was kind of floating around in the family. It's kind of weird, you look back at your life and you're like, oh, I guess I was on a path. I had no idea. But OT just totally spoke to me because there's such a huge psychological element, and that's really pushed. And then it's function, but it's also not function at the expense of the human spirit. It's function and independence and whatever that person cares about. So if you need to spend an hour on buttoning because that gentleman really wants to wear a button-down suit, then that's what you do. And I love that. It's so client-focused. And that's what I've kind of kept with me because, as I've worked at different hospitals and it's been harder to be client-focused, that's really where Heal the Brain with Jane came out of, because I was like, why did I get into this? This is why, because I love people, and there's so much healing within yourself, within what you love to do. And if I'm doing that, then everything else falls into place. So.
Well, I think what's really interesting there, well, lots of things actually, but one of the things that jumps out at me is the way you talk about it in the priorities for the person you're talking with, and it being less procedure oriented. That actually is one of the things that I teach folks when I teach sales. Because when I talk to salespeople, especially newer salespeople in the technology space, the main thing I want to do is teach them to focus on benefits, not features. Because it doesn't matter how many features a product has. All that matters is what it will actually do for the customer. What is the end result they are going to get? And whether that is being able to submit a budget faster or button their clothes more effectively, it's the same thing. It's the focus on that actual benefit, that enhancement to their life, whether that's a personal life or a work life.
That makes so much sense. And actually, we did talk a lot about buy-in. Like, if that person doesn't have buy-in, and I really still struggle with this because one of the things my wise therapist husband and mother-in-law, psychologist, they're always like, Jane, if that person, if you're working harder than the person you're working with, then that's not right. And that kind of, it kind of ties into that, because if you can get that buy-in, if you can say like, this works, and if you work this, it'll work, then you don't have that mismatch of effort. Because I've had times where I've been like, I'll call you every day and I'll text you and I'll, and that person is just like, no, like they won't say no outright, but they're not invested. It's a similar idea. That just struck me as similar because, if you miss the buy-in, then you miss the actual, like, you get an imbalance of effort immediately. So
yeah, exactly. When we talk about, I talk about attitude a lot, because attitude matters. But I think the idea of the positive attitude has gotten has picked up a lot of cultural baggage.
Yes.
With the, if you just think good things will happen. It's like, no, that's not how it works.
And the people who are saying that, by the way, like, have they ever experienced anything hard in their life? Like, I just don't understand.
Right. Yeah, exactly. What I like to tell people is that, look, it's not just a positive attitude, it's an action-oriented attitude. And even then, the right attitude is a necessary condition for recovery, but it is not sufficient. You still got to do the work, and your body and brain still have to have the core physical resources that they need to do the recovery.
Right.
But without the right attitude, you're just not going to get anywhere. You're not going to do the work that you need to do to make it happen.
Yeah, you have to get into a headspace of change. One of the things I really like, have you heard of the trans-theoretical model of change? It has like a really big name, but it's just really being able to examine where you are in the change process. And it's not linear, but it has 5 stages that I wish I could recite right now. But anyway, you go from
we'll certainly link to that in the
show
notes over at strokecast.com/Jane.
Oh, awesome. I love it. But it's very helpful. It's a helpful tool. And sometimes I just put it on my desk and I'll just have it there. And so people can browse, if we're working on something, I'll just put it on the desk because, you could be 1 week, you could be in I think it's called the pre-thinking stage. And then you could go right up to the contemplative stage. And there's all these different stages. But the point is that sometimes it's hard to see where you are in that process and hard to see that you're not certain personalities are certainly more action oriented than others. They're delightful to work with, I'll tell you what. Yeah. But there's others who struggle. I think I would be on the struggle bus. And I think that's maybe what makes me effective in that population of people who are just like, I just am so, 1 week I feel like I'm doing all my exercises and I've got a really good attitude. And the next week I feel like I don't know where to start, and that's normal. That's the change process. It's not, this happens this week and this happens that week, it goes back and forth.
And it's part of the normal change process that does it as well. But of course, also for most of the folks you work with, we also have brain damage. And the earlier we are in the process where we can sometimes have some of the fastest recovery is also when the brain is still traumatized and swollen and trying to adjust and trying to manage all this. So it makes any of this even that much more complicated.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's such a good point. And how many people too have, it's not like clinical amnesia, but you do get this amnesia of, some people do have amnesia, but where you don't remember where you've come from. Luckily I have been able to work with people for such a long time, which I'm so grateful for, because a lot of clinicians can't. And, I'll be like, don't you remember that you couldn't lift your arm at all?
Mm-hmm.
Don't you remember that was not that long ago? Like 7 months ago, you could not move it at all. And they're like, oh, but I was learning. But it's because they were learning to sit up and walk and
the other element of that too, and I think this is where there can be a disconnect between the experience of a therapist and a survivor, is that a therapist can look at it and go, yeah, don't you remember 7 months ago where you couldn't lift your arm at all, and now you can lift it halfway? Whereas a survivor is like, yes, but 7.1 months ago, I could lift it all the way over my head and wave it in the air like I just don't care.
yeah, that's so true.
And I think so. I think part of it is, as a therapist sees us starting from zero.
Right.
That is our initial state, and then everything we do from there is tremendous progress. Whereas we see it as we were at 500. And now we're at 0.
Yeah.
So getting up to 1 or 2 or doubling that to 4 or 10, that still can seem insignificant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that I constantly have to remind myself of. And it's something that this is an awesome topic, because I'm of the mind that when a survivor comes in and has accepted, this happened to me, and I am from this point moving, this is my new self, my 2.0, I think they tend to do better. But that's such a difficult conversation that clinicians aren't having that with people, because that's a very sensitive thing. Who you were pre-stroke needs to be a part of who you are post-stroke, but it also can't define who you are post-stroke. So I struggle with that personally still. How's it been for you with the coronavirus?
That has had minimal negative impact.
Oh, that's right, because you work in technology.
Yeah, so I've been working remotely to begin with.
Oh, that's perfect.
And I think one of the positive impacts out of the coronavirus, well, there's a couple of things from the disability community, is that, first of all, we're seeing more of these curbside pickups happening and these opportunities with even simple grocery store, which is just such a lifesaver for people with disabilities who struggle to get up and burn all that energy.
Oh, yeah. And who have compromised immune systems. In general, I'm like, why didn't we have this before?
Exactly. It's been a tremendous forcing factor. And I think for everybody who lost their job because their job would not provide work from home accommodations prior to coronavirus because it was just too difficult, they've now proven that it's not too difficult. And so I think that opens up tremendous opportunities for people with disabilities to actually acquire real full-time, legitimate remote work that companies are going to have to accommodate because they've discovered that they can. And I think a lot of organizations didn't think they could, but they've learned that they can. And I think that is overall, it's going to be really positive for the community.
That's such a good point. And we really do need more of that. I mean, it's our system right now it's so hard for persons with cognitive and physical disabilities because, you can, even though there are laws in place, there is still so much in our social makeup that makes it very difficult to get a job. And then, with how benefits work, you have to make sure that you're not making too much if you're going to get benefits. It's just it's a very difficult system, and it's so hard to navigate, especially in the United States. I mean, it's like impossible. I've called people and I'm like, I don't know what to say.
Exactly. The process of applying for disability, the more likely you are to need to be legitimately qualified for disability, the harder time you're going to have navigating the process.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, forget it. If you have a cognitive issue, forget it. It is, and that's what it needs to be made for. It's really tough. But I'm with you. That's such a good point that I hope that this makes a lot of opportunities. I think already social media has given a lot of persons with disabilities a platform and a way, hopefully, to make a living while they're advocating, for the community. And I hope we just have more and more of that, because the more that we have of that, the more that we understand that, the better we will be to really have more equity in our society.
Absolutely. And I think you can just you can take a quick look at things like on Instagram. If you do a search for the hashtag stroke, or even getting beyond our own particular community, you do a search on the hashtags around wheelchairs, and you see some people doing amazing things despite whatever their disabilities. And on the flip side, if you want to see more of the challenges that people are now speaking up about, hop on over to Twitter and do a search on the hashtag ableds are weird. And I'll link to that in the show notes. And you see some of the things that people with disabilities are now, struggle with, that we've struggled with for decades, for centuries, really. But now there's an opportunity to actually share that story and to tell that story and to let those voices be heard, so we can actually start talking about doing something about it. Absolutely.
It's so funny. It actually makes me think of, have you heard of this? There's really sweet sister pair in Ireland, and they make Izzy's wheels. And they make these like really bright, beautiful floral wheels. And they became like a multi-million-dollar company that gives so much to charity. It's insane. But basically, that one sister is able-bodied, and then she has another sister who's in a wheelchair, and she got her wheels to just kind of reflect her age, and they're fun and beautiful and very artistic. And then they made this amazing company. And it just made me think of that, because that was one of the first things that I saw when I jumped on Instagram and started to look through these hashtags. And I was like, oh my gosh, like how many times have I had a young person in my office who I'm like, oh, you need something different. Like this is, like it doesn't have to be this sad equipment. Like we can make this better. You know what I mean? And more reflective of you. So it's just really cool.
Yeah. Well, when we look beyond there too, I mean, one of the things that, I left the hospital with my simple $7 metal cane. And since then, fashionablecanes.com has gotten a bunch of my money by actually having nice looking canes. Of course, on their website, for litigious reasons, they have to state that these are not intended for medical purposes, yada, yada, yada. But that doesn't stop me from relying on them.
Oh, yeah. And that's a really good point. I mean, they have to do that just because of legal, BS. But my dad, this was horrible, though, because he's got like a real personality. When and by that, I mean, he's what the kids call extra. But he went to CVS and he got 2 like tiger canes. They and striped and like bright, and he was like wearing them out, just loving it and just making this huge statement with his canes. It made me laugh so hard, but we were also embarrassed too, which he loved.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
I'm going to have to send you a link though, because my favorite thing for post-stroke for gait is actually a staff. And I found these really beautiful ones on Amazon, and it's a small company, and they're real wood and they're carved, and I think they're like under $30. And I've given them away as gifts, and I recommend them to most of the people I work with. The reason being, when you lean on a cane, sometimes that can reinforce the weaker side. So what I usually try to do, depending on where you are and where everyone is in their journey, have you start on your affected side holding the cane. So, because then you're upright and you end up using more of the less affected side, and the more affected side in a better synergy. Anyway, I will send you the link because it's my favorite, and I'm always telling everybody to get it.
And it sounds like a great way to get started on your Mad Eye Moody cosplay from Harry Potter.
It's true. That's so funny. Yesterday it was pretty cold here in cold for us. You're in Seattle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not cold, but it was colder. And
so San Luis, so you're in mid-California, so
yeah.
Cold snap got down under 75?
Yeah, exactly. It was like in the 60s, and we're like, ooh, brr. And so we watched Harry Potter with some of my kids' cousins came over, and that I'm so glad that you said that. That made me laugh.
And that gets to one of the other things I've been frustrated about too, is when I did start shopping for canes, I started looking for more genre-oriented stuff. And out of the Harry Potter world, you got Mad Eye, or you've got Lucius Malfoy's cane, but there's no Ravenclaw canes out there.
Yeah, I know, that's messed up. That shouldn't be. That should not be.
And there's tremendous opportunity for somebody who wants to go ahead and do the licensing or whatever. And, between Star Trek themed, Lord of the Rings themed, all of these different genres out there, that there's this tremendous thing where, a lot of survivors are embarrassed about their mobility equipment.
Right.
And you don't have to be. This is... Especially as a guy, we don't have as many fashion accessories. I get to wield a cool fashion accessory.
Exactly. Now. Well, it's interesting to me that I mean, I guess it's not, because that is par for the course. But like, why hasn't that been a focus? I mean, we have everything else so commercialized, so put in our face, so like, buy this, And you're right, it's a total missed opportunity, but that's because disabilities are pretty invisible, even if they're visible in our society. It's like,
people don't want to see the disabled.
Yes, I have this theory that it's like any kind of ableism is this idea that you got to stay small, stay on your side of the street, use your bland cane and go about your business because your disability makes me feel some way about my ability, or you know what I mean? And I think that it's very cool that we are on the internet and that we're hearing these voices, because people are not staying small. People are getting big, and they're saying, I can have like a really cool looking wheelchair that's like amazing and feels like art. And, and I can have a Ravenclaw cane if I want. You know what I mean? And and I hope we keep just going in that.
Does my gait belt have to be beige?
No, I know. Well, I have a real problem with gait belts in general. But yes, why do they have to be beige? But a lot of it is because of the medical model that we're in, that I think we're trying to move away from. But it's in some ways, but it's going to be a really hard thing, because also it's not like it's anybody's making, like, except for, I don't know who, the insurance companies, I suppose, are making a lot of money but we don't have like the best products. Like, I look through a lot of medical supply stores, but I honestly like to go to Etsy or Amazon or places like that for expediency, but also because the surcharge is so much higher if you go through a medical supplier. So that's a real problem. If if the insurance won't cover it, which is very common with long-term chronic illness type deals. And so, yeah, I have a really hard time with that industry in general. It annoys me.
Well, we're going to have to spend some more time talking about the industry in general on a future conversation.
Yes.
But one of the things I wanted to talk about today also is your brand is all around healing the brain. And I know my initial, when I initially was in the hospital, I personally did not like the word heal because it felt very passive to me. So I liked instead focusing on what I need to do to recover rather than letting things happen to me. And that was my own perceptions of the word. So what I want to understand is, I mean, what does it mean to you to heal?
Yeah. To me, and actually healing the brain, I did struggle because, I was an English major, like we talked about. Words mean a lot to me. And I did struggle with kind of figuring out if I was comfortable with that branding because my understanding of healing, that I don't know if that's the more common understanding, is that it's a process, that it's not like it's never done. And that can be daunting and that can be depressing, but that's also a thing of hope. And that has been what I've really noticed in working in this population, is that the idea of healing, that you can find wholeness wherever you are in the process, is really a thing of hope. And when I was looking into, how I wanted this to look, and how I wanted to present myself, the old English understanding of to be healing or to heal is just to be whole. And I think that you can be in any part of your disability, but you can still find that wholeness. And that, I think that to me is what healing is. So it doesn't mean that you don't have a disability or that you're not challenged in some way or that you're not working through something, but that you feel whole. That's really what's most important to me. So it's a different understanding, I think, of healing. It's not curative.
So yeah, so I think that is very interesting, that it is not necessarily curative. The idea is that no matter where you are in the process, you're still a whole person who may or may not be able to do certain things at this point in time.
And I really do think that no matter what the goals are, the outcomes, whatever test you've been given, that doesn't matter as long as you have a sense of self that is separate from your disability. That's kind of radical thinking, because I shouldn't say that insurance companies will not fund what I'm doing. But I really believe that with my whole heart.
And I think that's important. I think that's one of the things too we're getting at when we talk about the idea of, the importance of the language you use to describe ourselves as people with disabilities or disabled people. I mean, that difference in language helps draw that separation between who we are as a person versus the disabilities that we have.
Yeah, exactly. It's really important to see who we are as individuals. And I wonder too if our language around disability is going to change in the future too. Because even disability kind of has it has a very negative connotation. And we just don't have a lot of language for how we refer to ourselves, how we refer to our hemiplegic side. I'm on the workshops that I do online, which have been so much fun. Oh my gosh. But I'm constantly redirecting people, and they'll be like, well, Jane, are you showing your bad side, or are we supposed to be using our bad side or our good side? I'm like, they're neither good nor bad. Your brain affected both sides of your body, by the way, one side more than the other, and really let's step away from that language. you don't have a bad arm. You don't have a bad leg. You have a more affected leg and a less affected leg. And I'm hoping that we can find even better language to describe our body and describe what we're going through.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. When we look at, just how the language has evolved over the last 40 years alone, it's pretty amazing. We've gone from crippled to handicapped to disabled to alternately abled to people with disabilities and people with various things, from wheelchair bound to wheelchair freed to wheelchair users, to all of these different things, and then seeing how different communities are adopting their own. I mean, I think most of the folks I talk with in the stroke community talk about people, us having disabilities, whereas the language within that I see from a lot of the autism community is people choosing to describe themselves as autistic people rather than people with autism. Yeah. And it's fascinating how that shapes up. And, back to the stroke community, the difference between being a stroke victim and a stroke survivor.
The words matter. The words really matter. And I get really feisty. I know, shocking, but I get upset when people are like, oh, I know that's not the PC term or whatever. It's like, it's not about a PC term. It's about branding somebody so that they feel inferior to you. And it's important. It's important what you call somebody. It's important what a group calls themselves. So that's really been a big focus for me too. Yeah.
So you're still getting to flex all of those English major muscles.
I guess so. It's interesting that what I'm doing is really a confluence of what I love, because I write a little, on the blog and when I can on sending out posts and stuff. And so it's like, oh, this is what I'm seeing in my work, and this is how I'm going to put it into words. And when I talked with Dr. Sullivan, she talked about how she feels sometimes like she's a translator, like she's translating, this is what I know from my neuropsychology background, and I'm going to translate it to you so that you can use it in your everyday. And I was like, yes, exactly. We're constantly, picking our words really carefully to kind of get that nuance, because the brain is nuanced and it's changing always. And so you have to stay up on the language and up on the research and figure out how to convey that in a way that's sensitive to the nuances for each person. It's actually exhausting.
Yep, very much so. Very much so. So why did you start the Heal the Brain with Jane podcast, the No Brainer podcast?
I think I just wanted another way to communicate with people like you and to make connection. And as you know, a lot of the persons in our community can't read at certain points, or it's difficult for them to hop even on a Zoom meeting or something. So podcasts are just great because they're free, and I can interview all these people that I admire. And for me, it's actually really selfish, because I get to say I'm working, take my kids, and I get to pick the brains of brilliant people, and then hopefully somebody else gets something out of this conversation. So that's really, it's really pretty selfish.
Awesome. That's a big win then.
Yeah, I love it. It's like my me time. I got to, I'm serious. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to interview, people I admire and see how they've figured things out. And hopefully it'll make me be a better clinician.
And it's amazing how many people, if you just ask, will say yes and be on the show.
I know. I was very nervous, for the first couple of people. One person that was super out of my comfort zone is Linda Graham, who's a psychotherapist, and she's written 2 books on resilience. And she was my second guest. And I listened to another podcast called The One You Feed. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
Oh, Bill, it's so good.
I'll have to check it out.
It's a little like heady, but I really like it because it's all about kind of self-improvement and reading from our modern day philosophers. But anyway, so I heard her on the podcast and I pulled over and then I emailed her. I pulled over driving to work, and I was like, I'm just going to email her. I'm just going to try. And she wrote back right away and said I'd be honored. And I was like, what? Do you know me? You know what I mean? Like, it was like, I was just thrilled. So it's been awesome.
And that brings us to our hack of the week.
F societal norms. Just be like, this is where I'm at. And don't worry about what everybody else is thinking. That was my genuine thought. Like, just forget it. Because how much chaos that can cause sometimes. And it's like, who cares? Who cares what Betty thinks?
Well, Jane, this has been an absolute delight. I got to almost nothing on my outline, which is fine.
That's the best ones.
It means we'll have to do this again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill. This is awesome. And next time I promise we won't have a child in the background saying caw caw.
Yeah, we don't generally do the show with a live audience, but hey, you never know. In late July, Jane launched a new membership program called Like-Minded. It's a program for brain injury survivors, their families, and their caregivers. Like-Minded includes authors, nutritionists, yoga instructors, and clinicians who are passionate about filling in the gaps of post-stroke and post-TBI or traumatic brain injury care. Leaders in the program are survivors themselves or caretakers with intimate understanding of the recovery experience. And that leadership team even includes Strokecast guests Joe Borges, Ella Sophia, and Dr. Karen Sullivan. Really, it's a delightful group of people. These individuals have realized that their unique journey with brain injury granted them access to a very special community. The brain injury community is a supportive group of people who have been through it all and come out the other side with a burning desire to help others get through this difficult time. You can learn more about this program and check it out and see the other instructors and leaders over at healingthebrainwithjane.com. Or just visit the link in the show notes at strokecast.com/Jane. Social media is a large part of how Jane supports her mission, and each platform within the social media context has its own culture. In fact, it's through Instagram that Jane and I first met. But when we look at the different platforms, the communities form in a different way. For example, if you follow the #stroke community on Twitter, it's mostly filled with medical and research professionals, as well as some commercial providers. On Instagram, however, if you search for the #stroke, the community you'll find there is mostly survivors, along with physical therapists, occupational therapists, and speech-language pathologists who work with survivors on a daily basis. It tends to be a more personal, experience-based community. There are dozens of Facebook stroke support groups, and each of them have sort of their own unique culture that's usually driven by the personality of their founder and how aggressively they moderate and how they define the rules and culture of that group. None of those are bad. And I actually recommend exploring all of them so you can find the community that's really going to resonate with you the most, because that's the community you should spend the time in, the community that you can actually connect with, that you can feel value from, and that you can contribute your own value in return. So explore some of the different stroke-related social media communities and go ahead and find your tribe. You can follow Jane on Instagram at heal.the.brain.withjane, and you can learn more about her work and podcast over at healingthebrainwithjane.com. Share this episode with 3 people by giving them the link strokecast.com/Jane. Be sure to subscribe to the Strokecast in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.